So my name is Azim Ibrahim. I'm a Senior Director at the New Lines Institute think tank in Washington. We're a relatively new think tank, but we have a new centre focusing exclusively on the Western Balkans, and we have an annual conference, the Sarajevo Security Conference, which has become the flagship conference of the region. Ladies and gentlemen, we are at the 30th anniversary of the Dayton Peace Agreement, and we are reminded of its paradoxical legacy. Yes, Dayton ended the devastating war of Bosnia from 92 to 95, a conflict that claimed over 100,000 lives and displaced half the population, and marked the first genocide in Europe since the Holocaust. And yes, it remains the gold standard for peace agreements, having held Bosnia together with minimal international military presence, down from 60,000 NATO troops in 1995 to just 1,100 Eurofor personnel today. Yet its constitution is enshrined in Annex 4 and has been described as a festering quagmire. The sectarian power-sharing system it established is discriminatory, dysfunctional, and in direct violation of the European Convention on Human Rights, as ruled by the European Court of Human Rights and Bosnia's own constitutional court. This flawed framework empowers separatist vetoes, fuels political crisis, and as we speak, emboldens secessionist threats that push the country towards collapse. Today, we will be exploring why constitutional reform is a legal and political imperative, the competing interests that are thwarting this progress, and the path towards a rational democratic governance regime. And allow me to introduce our distinguished panel to discuss this. We have Ambassador Michael Murphy, the former US Ambassador to Bosnia and Herzegovina, who brings unparalleled diplomatic experience and knowledge of this region, having navigated the intricacies of the Dayton implementation plan and US policy in the region during one of the most critical periods. We have Mr. Ensar Iminovic, Minister Councillor and Deputy Chief of Mission at the Bosnian Embassy in Washington, D.C. He offers an authoritative perspective from Sarajevo on the urgent need for reform to strengthen Bosnia's sovereignty and functionality, a highly experienced diplomat who served as ambassador to Thailand, Malaysia, and Brunei. We have Mr. Ambassador Zuzul, the former Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of Croatia, to provide insights into Croatia's role as a regional stakeholder and its complex influence on Bosnia's political landscape. He was also an active participant in the Dayton Peace Accords, so has first-hand knowledge of this apparatus. And finally, we have Dr. Yasmin Mojanovic, Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the New Lines Institute, Western Balkan Centre, and author of the Dayton Plus report, and is a leading scholar whose work incisively critiques Dayton's constitutional flaws and proposes actionable reforms. Together, our panel will reflect on the imperatives of constitutional reform that can move Bosnia from sectarianism to potential EU and NATO membership. So let me start off, first of all, with Dr. Mojanovic, Senior Fellow at the New Lines Institute. So Dr. Mojanovic, your report, most recent report, Dayton Plus, Policymakers' Guide to Constitutional Reform in Bosnia-Herzegovina, has been described as one of the most comprehensive of its kind. You mention in the report that the Dayton Constitution is inherently discriminatory and dysfunctional. Can you possibly explain why constitutional reform is a legal and political necessity, particularly given the European Court of Human Rights ruling on Bosnia? Because after all, the counter-argument to any reform is that the current setup has worked. Do we have war in Bosnia at the moment? No. So the current setup has worked, so why tinker with it? Can you highlight us, give us your input on that?
Thank you very much, Azim. Thank you to all my co-panelists here, and thank you for all of you for attending this session, and of course McTurner's office for organizing all of this. So I think we need to step back a little bit. There's a little bit of a joke in Bosnia to describe what happened in the 1990s, which is that Croatia and Serbia had a war and Bosnia lost. And that's in some ways sort of the quickest way to explain in many ways the critical flaws with the Dayton Constitutional Order, as we might refer to it. Because, of course, Dayton is both a peace agreement and it is a constitution. Annex 4 of the Dayton Peace Agreement is the constitution of Bosnia-Herzegovina. It is unique in the world in that respect. But interestingly, one of the things that was included in Dayton, and one of the things that I think even the belligerents at the time, so the government of Franjo Tudjman in Croatia, the regime of Slobodan Milošević in Serbia, and of course the government of the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina did not, I think, fully appreciate at the time, was that there was a particular clause included in the Constitution itself, and that is Article 2.2. And Article 2.2 says that the European Convention on Human Rights takes supremacy over all Bosnian domestic law. Experts have since sort of come to the view that Article 2.2 is in effect a kind of veritable sunset clause, right? Of course, it's a sunset clause that is not activated in and of itself. It has to be sort of activated through the legal process. I think for the first sort of 15 to 20 years after the end of the war, all Bosnians and Herzegovinians from all ethnic communities and all other communities in the country were really just very satisfied with the fact that the agreement had held, that the country was at peace, it was progressing as it was. But as the relationship in particular with the EU evolved, and there came to be a greater and greater expectation that Bosnia-Herzegovina was actually going to have a European future, it was going to have an Atlantic future, that then brought to bear questions of basic civil rights, democratic equity, and legal equality, right? Which, of course, is not part of the Dayton Constitution, right? For instance, the Dayton Constitution is significant as being probably the only constitution in the world which puts citizens, i.e. the actual category of citizens, into a secondary legal category. Because virtually all political primacy and rights in Bosnia-Herzegovina are given to the three so-called constituent peoples, Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats. Interestingly, it's never defined in the Constitution what that is. We all know who they are. We don't know why they have special magical rights that, for instance, Bosnian Jews don't have, or Bosnian Roma don't have, or somebody who just identifies as being Bosnian, or, for instance, somebody who's from a mixed marriage, and so on and so forth. So basically, beginning in 2009, you had a series of civil rights cases that were brought to the European Convention, or pardon me, the European Court of Human Rights on the basis of the ECHR. And in every single instance since then, there's been nearly a dozen of these cases, the court has quite promptly ruled that virtually every single aspect of the kind of existing, shall we say, power-sharing modalities of the Dayton Constitution are discriminatory. Because, you know, the sort of the easiest example of this was the first of these decisions. It's called the Sejdić-Finci decision by the European Court of Human Rights out of 2009. This was brought by a gentleman who's kind of the titular head of the Bosnian Jewish community, Jakub Finci, and Mr. Dervo Sejdić, who's kind of the titular head of the Romani community. And they said, look, the Bosnian state presidency is discriminatory on the grounds that it's only reserved to Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats. And not even then, right? Because there's another additional caveat. So for instance, if you're a Croat from the RS entity, you can't be elected to the Croat seat on the state presidency. You have to be from the federation. Likewise, if you are, for instance, a Serb from the federation entity, you can't be elected to the Serb seat on the state presidency. And again, as I said, if you're Jewish, if you're a Roma, if you identify simply as being Bosnian, you can't be elected. And so the sort of the long and short of it is we have had a series of binding international decisions, but also, again, decisions by local courts, the Constitutional Court of Bosnia-Herzegovina, that has very explicitly said that this kind of a very, very hard-line ethnic power-sharing modality, and we've heard some advocacy over the past few days, I think in particular by our colleagues from Croatia, as to why they believe that this is a system that should be preserved and in fact deepened. This is not in line with the European Convention on Human Rights, and it's also very importantly not in line with the EU acquis. So the fundamental contradiction, to basically sum it up in a word, in contemporary Bosnia-Herzegovina is that all of the legal precedent and weight is on the side of reforming this constitution in line with the European Convention on Human Rights. Unfortunately, most of the political appetite and political will is on the side of those who want to maintain a system, not just of sectarianism, but as we heard yesterday, for instance, during the opening panel when we had some of the foreign ministers on stage, a system that still maintains, for instance, segregated schools. Right? This is the infamous case of the so-called 2 schools under 1 roof. A country that has segregated schools cannot join the EU. It cannot join NATO, and it realistically is not a country that has a particularly bright democratic future ahead of itself. So this report that we've published through the New Lines Institute is not an attempt to dismantle the Dayton Agreement. It's not an attempt to, reinvent the wheel. It's actually just the idea of doing something that Ambassador Murphy, once upon a time, if I understand correctly, was involved in, which is the April package. This was a constitutional reform package, the closest that Bosnia-Herzegovina has ever come to constitutional reform since the original Dayton negotiations, to take essentially what was the April package and essentially update it with some of the decisions that have come down since '09 from the European Court of Human Rights, and to just very gently move the needle towards full civic equality in line with the EU acquis.
Superb. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Majanovic, that overview. So my next question to Ambassador Murphy. You've heard it here, Ambassador, from one of the leading constitutional experts on this Dayton Agreement and on Bosnia, that the agreement is not in line with the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights. It is discriminatory against civil rights, democratic integrity and human rights, and citizens that are not within the 3 groups are secondary citizens. As the most recent US ambassador, you observed the early successes of the Dayton implementation, such as the creation of the unified state institutions. But since then, since 2006, the United States has reduced its engagement dramatically in the region. How does Washington now view this new constitutional reform that's in the pipeline as a legal and political necessity to counter Bosnia's ongoing dysfunction and secessionist tendencies?
That's a big question. Let me start with an observation. I'm not sure some of the local political leaders would view the last 3 years in Bosnia-Herzegovina as the absence of U.S. engagement. Some of them might actually argue we've been too engaged. But to go back to 2006, look, I think at the time, a series of decisions were made based upon an assessment of where Bosnia and Herzegovina was, particularly the successes of the first 10 years after Dayton, and with the promise having been made in Thessaloniki that Bosnia-Herzegovina would join the European Union, that it was appropriate for the international community to step back, and that the incentive structure provided by the European Union and European leadership would result in the progress we all expected, because the soft power or the attractive power of the European Union was sufficient to compel political leaders to change or to adjust. That theory of change was wrong. Right? Now, I heard earlier today some of my European colleagues talk about the decisions that were taken over the last couple of years. Were they geopolitical decisions, or were they based on progress? The honest answer to that question, and no disrespect to my European colleagues, everybody's got their talking points, right? We all have to adhere to them. This was a geopolitical decision to move BIH forward. It was the right decision to move BIH forward. The geopolitical world since 2022, I would argue prior to that, but certainly had changed in a way that we needed to pull Bosnia, we the international community needed to pull Bosnia closer. But it wasn't because tremendous amounts of progress were made. I mean, there were the 14 points, there were the 8 steps, there was 1+3, there was 1.5, well, just that, I mean, progress wasn't being made. The U.S. role from 2006 until more recently, going back to where I was a function of these decisions that we had made, thinking that things could progress the way we'd hoped, but didn't. I would argue that the international community should have woken up much earlier than 2021, 2022, to the problems in BIH and the need for there to be a robust international community role in BIH. It shouldn't have taken 15 years to figure out that we had a problem, right? Because the problems were apparent as far back as 2007 and 2000, with the destruction of the April package, frankly, but after that, with some of what we saw beginning to emerge from Mr. Dodick and the RS in 2007 forward. I understand the interest people have and the belief people have that local actors need to solve local problems. And constitutional reform is going to require local actors to reach compromises, which they've been unwilling to do. The High Rep cannot impose it, the ECHR cannot impose it, the actors on the ground are going to have to be engaged. But that's a very different thing than saying we all should take kind of a benign neglect approach to what's going on in Bosnia-Herzegovina. That's a mistake. The fact of the matter is, and this is an uncomfortable fact for a lot of people, that local ownership right now is not producing positive results for BIH. What do we have today in BIH? Secessionism, as manifest in Mr. Dodick's actions and rhetoric and in what's happening in the RS, is the most serious and dangerous threat to the country since 1992, right? You've got other parties seeking to exploit that for their own narrow, self-interested, ethno-nationalist reasons, right? And left unchecked, bad things are going to happen. And whether it's the European Union or the United States, we have an interest in the territorial integrity of BIH. The lessons of history are, if you're not paying attention to these issue sets, and the country splits or breaks, it is very unlikely to be a peaceful split or break. So we can't afford to ignore these problems. That requires a more robust level of international community engagement. It includes both the carrot of EU membership, I think that's right. That is the ultimate long-term goal, it's the right strategic objective, but also includes sticks. I think sanctions are effective, for example. It requires a robust, capable EUFOR presence on the ground, one that can defend the Dayton Peace Agreement and one that can maintain a safe and secure environment. And it requires accepting that we need the OHR and we need the bond powers. Again, I think the evidence on the ground is clear of that. Until we reset the rules of the game and get people back to the place where we need them to be, which is making constructive decisions on behalf of the citizens and the constituent peoples that they represent. And I make one last point about all this, because it's tangential, but I think it's important. One of the problems with dialogue about Bosnia and Herzegovina, whether it's inside Bosnia and Herzegovina or from outside Bosnia and Herzegovina, is that we want to confuse a particular political leader with a particular party with a particular constituent people. Milorad Dodik is not the avatar of all Serbs. He's not even necessarily representative of everybody in his party. Dragan Čović is not the avatar of all Croats, let alone HDZ-BIH. And the same is true for Bakir Izetbegović, Bosniaks, and SDA. When we do that, we fall into the very trap they're setting for us. Dragan Čović's interests may not coincide with the interests of the Croats living in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Mr. Dodik's interests may not coincide with the interests of the Serbs living in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Mr. Izetbegović's may not coincide with the Bosniaks living in Bosnia-Herzegovina. In my experience engaging people there, I lived there for 6 years, is that most of them don't necessarily want what their leaders are selling. Now, there's a lot of reasons why this happens, why they get reelected. That's another question entirely. What they want for themselves is a democratic, peaceful, prosperous future inside the EU, right? They're not interested in the corruption. I don't think they're interested in fighting their neighbor. But there are dangers now in BIH that we need to be sensitive to. It is a mistake, I think, to pretend or to wish away the threat that Mr. Dodik's actions of late present, right? I think all of the member states in the European Union, particularly its neighbors, but also the United States, needs to be concerned about what it means for the territorial integrity of that country. Because, as I said at the beginning, and then I'll stop, that is our fundamental interest, our fundamental hard security interest. And if we lose it, you know, bad things are likely to happen, and that's not in the interest of anybody in the region, and certainly not in the interests of the people of BIH.
Thank you so much for that. I think you made a very good point. Political leaders are not necessarily representative of the people and don't necessarily represent their interest. And, we can be sitting here, far away in the United States. We can be very intellectually lazy and just put them all into one pot. My next question goes to Ambassador Aminowicz. Ambassador Murphy highlighted very clearly that more robust engagement is certainly needed from the United States, but at the end of the day, it is local actors that must implement that reform. This reform cannot be imposed from the outside by any actor. And we've also heard from Dr. Mojanovic that Bosnia-Herzegovina has a legal obligation to implement the ruling of the ECHR, and this is a core prerequisite to advancing the country's European membership ambitions. In your estimation, what more can Bosnian Americans and European partners do to encourage local leaders to push forward on these reforms? And what must Bosnians themselves in Bosnia, especially with respect to the recent current secessionist crisis in your country, what must they do to try to bring this forward?
Thank you, Azim. Just to add to what Yasmin said at the beginning, speaking about Article 2 of the Constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina, in addition to the fact that the European Convention on Human Rights has priority over all other laws in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Article 2 clearly states that the rights and freedoms set forth in the European Convention for the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms and its protocols shall be applied directly in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Unfortunately, that's not the case today. And due to the fact that we have a number of rulings by the European Court of Human Rights since 2009 until today that have not been implemented, we can argue that Bosnia and Herzegovina is in a kind of a constitutional crisis. The ECHR rulings against Bosnia and Herzegovina have opened up an opportunity for the Bosnian state to set forth real reforms that would open the door for a, I would say, post-Dayton social contract. In many ways, that is the natural stepping stone that the late Ambassador Richard Holbrooke actually envisioned some 30 years ago to happen in Bosnia, Dayton, as a temporary peace deal that would lead to more just, more functional, more European Bosnian society and the state. Unfortunately, as I said, that has not happened. So back to your questions, what more can Bosnian American European partners do to encourage local leaders to push forward with these reforms? Well, I would just like to highlight a few points. One is condition financial and political support on reform progress. The EU and the US should clearly link economic aid, investments, and political backing to tangible progress in implementing ECHR rulings and strengthening democratic institutions. Of course, this would include clear benchmarks and timelines and so on. In other words, should condition deeper integration on irreversible legal and political steps, not just promises. You know, Bosnia and Herzegovina, unfortunately, has a long history of verbal commitments with little follow-through. So tangible milestones must be required for accessing EU funds, for different programs and other bilateral benefits. Secondly, I think our European and American partners should expand targeted sanctions and visa restrictions. It means that they should apply greater pressure on obstructionist political actors, particularly those fueling secessionist rhetoric, through sanctions that target individuals rather than population at large. So this would, I would say, this should also apply to status quo preservationists in Bosnia, who block the fulfillment of basic human rights and constitutional commitments. In addition, our friends and partners in the US and the EU can enhance diplomatic pressure and visibility. That would include high-level visits, public statements, etc. And they should consistently emphasize the importance that Bosnia and Herzegovina should become a member of both NATO and the EU. In addition, our partners can help us with offering technical and legal assistance when it comes to the implementation of the ECHR rulings, particularly regarding the discrimination and power sharing and so on. And there is one thing in Yasmin's report that I noted down where our friends can help us, that is restrict the ability of neighboring countries to meddle in Bosnia and Herzegovina's domestic affairs, greatly reducing prospects for a renewed conflict. So now what we as Bosnians can do, but we must do, with respect to the current secession crisis in our country? Well, I would say that our position is obviously that the responsibility for our country's progress and security is first and foremost our own. Yesterday we heard our foreign minister here speaking, and he said that we need the leaders who are brave, who are courageous, who will lead, basically, but our political system is unfortunately exceptionally complex. So that is difficult to achieve in practice. But that is where actually we are grateful for the continuing support of our partners from the US and the EU. And their involvement can facilitate a more meaningful dialogue. They can assist our institutions in countering anti-constitutional activities, including those activities that, while not necessarily criminal, but are intended to derail Bosnia from its NATO and EU path. What also we as Bosnians can do, we can and we must support judicial independence and our anti-corruption efforts. Both citizens and institutions alike must push for a stronger judiciary capable of enforcing ECHR decisions and rulings and deterring political corruption. Both of these are essential requirements for EU integration. And also, our law enforcement authorities must be given full support to enforce verdicts of local courts, especially verdicts against those who undermine our constitutional order. So in conclusion, I would say that ultimately reform in Bosnia and Herzegovina must be locally driven, but internationally supported. The current secession crisis, if undressed, risks undoing decades of progress. And only through a coordinated and principled approach, where both domestic and international actors play a role, can Bosnia fulfill its Euro-Atlantic aspirations and safeguard its sovereignty. And finally, I would like to just highlight one thing. I think it's not outside reality to state that the credibility of our Western partners is at stake in Bosnia. Because if Europe and the US cannot support and help deal with secessionist actors in Bosnia, who are actually petty politicians, how do they expect to deal with Vladimir Putin? Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mr. Ambassador. So let me come on finally to Ambassador Zuzul. So you heard very strong words there from Ambassador Imunovic that the country is currently in a constitutional crisis and how Richard Holbrooke designed the Dayton Agreement as a temporary procedural agreement, and it was not designed to be permanent. Croatia has made Bosnia's constitutional regime a central feature of its foreign policy, yet it's also been accused of the community as Plenković government seems uniquely focused on furthering deepening ethnic tensions in Bosnia. What is Croatia's role and how can they contribute to this procedure in a more constructive manner?
Thank you very much for giving me a floor and for inviting me here. I am very emotional to be 30 years after Dayton again here, because there are not too many of us who were in Dayton in that time from Croatian side, only Minister Granic and myself from American side, General Clark and Ambassador Hill. From international side, I believe Wolfgang Ischinger is somewhere around, Carl Bildt, and that's about it. Nobody else is anymore, active or at least in position to talk. So I am emotional. And maybe on that emotion, I will continue very emotionally. I was surprised with the way how you finish your introduction. I'm not representing here Republic of Croatia. I represent my own opinion on how it was in Dayton, and I want to contribute, but trying to be constructive. But even more than surprise that came from your latest statement accusing one officially elected, democratically elected government, I was shocked, and I repeat, shocked, and personally offended with a bad joke that my neighbor on the left side started. I know he is raised in American tradition, and here when we are teaching our students, preparing them to give some speech, it's always good to start with a joke, but the worst is to start with a bad joke. Your joke is historically incorrect, and it is offensive for us. There was never war between Croats and Serbs. There was a Serbian aggression supported by Yugoslav army, first on Slovenia, then on Croatia, then on Bosnia and Herzegovina. And that is historical fact. If we are here to discuss that fact, there is nothing that we can talk. We cannot change history. We will not, sometimes we would like to change it, but unfortunately, in my eyes, at least in my eyes, that totally disqualify everything else what you are about to say. I am not saying that you are not maybe expert on the Constitution, but starting from something, some position which is historically untrue. And why offensive? I'll tell you why offensive to two of us, my friend Minister Granic and myself. We spent many, many times in a meeting with all representatives of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I had a great respect for President Izetbegovic. Very often I wouldn't share his opinion, but I appreciated the man. I appreciated his position. Never heard something what you said from him. We spent many times on talking. I'm proud to say that I was personally the one who prepared the first agreement on relation and cooperation between Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, signed by Presidents Tudjman and Izetbegovic in 1992 in Zagreb. The one who, I don't know, is he still active, Kasim Trnka, and myself, we spent the whole afternoon negotiating every word, and we finished in something very constructive. Now to come to something much closer I apologize, I'm really emotional for what you said. How we came to the Dayton, let me remind you, and it was said yesterday by several people, by Ambassador Galbraith. Holbrook writes about that in his book. Everybody says that. We came to the Dayton that based on the Washington agreement that, by the way, again, both of us, and particularly Minister Granic, participated very actively, we signed split agreement. Why split agreement signed at the beginning of August of 1995 is so crucial? With split agreement signed again by President Tudjman and Izetbegovic, supported by the Turkish delegation President Demirel personally and by United States, who sent Ambassador Galbraith to witness, I am using the we intentionally, we formed joint forces, joint Croatian, three-side forces, Croatian army, the Croats from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Bosniak army. We defeated the Serbian forces and we stopped the aggression. We, Bosniaks and Croats. So there was no war between Croats and Serbs that somebody can, looking from another planet, now declare it that way. It was aggression. It was effectively stopped with the Operation Storm. And after that, we came to the next stage, which is Dayton. On Dayton, we can disagree or agree on many things. My intentional idea was to explain how it was in Dayton, and I'm still willing to do that if I have a time. And hopefully to come to constructive conversation, because I do agree with everything that is, although I do not pretend to be expert in what is recently happening in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But I do feel like most of us that some changes are needed. I think that the Holbrook's works were interpreted a little bit too directly, but I do agree that every one of us in Dayton, we knew that Dayton will need to come to the upgrade. So, but to come to the constructive conversation, we cannot, but by starting redefining the history, the basic moment in the history. I do believe, and I'm still prepared in any capacity to work on a friendship between Bosnia and Herzegovina and Croatia. I do believe that that is necessary for also for Croatia, for Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina, for Bosnia and Herzegovina. I do believe that the only future, good future for Bosnia and Herzegovina and all citizens, it is to join to European Union. I think that Croatia should be, and it is, as much as I can see, is and should be the strongest supporter for that, because its own interest of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I do agree that we, or actually, to correct myself, that peoples of Bosnia and Herzegovina should negotiate, discuss every single issue, but starting from the constructive position. So I couldn't concentrate fully, and I'm not here to respond to any. I have my own opinion, and as well as you have it. But let me correct you also on some things. I didn't catch everything that you are saying. You were using one example which is wrong. You said that a Serb who lives on the territory of Federation cannot vote for a Serbian representative in Republika Srpska. That's fact. Or that Croats who lives in Republika Srpska cannot vote for the representatives of Croats in Federation. That is the fact. But American who lives in Massachusetts cannot vote for the representative for the state of Maine. The one who lives in state of Maine cannot vote for representatives of Massachusetts. I live in Washington, D.C. as a proud American. I cannot vote for anyone. I can vote for the president, but we do not have congressional representation. Instead of that, we have plates which says taxation, but no representation. That is the reality of federal system. We can discuss, is federal system good for some country or not? But this is not unique for Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is universal. When you try to interpret that as something which is against anyone in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's simply true. You really want to say that the United States is not democratic because of the fact, which is the fact that I said. So, I can come back later, maybe if somebody is interested, to explain you how we came to that model, how we came from the Federation to the Dayton, how we came to that sometimes strange construction of asymmetrical state, which is Bosnia and Herzegovina. But let me finish now. If we want to be constructive, we cannot, by changing the basic facts, and I'm coming and finishing with that. Basic fact is that there was aggression on the territory of former Yugoslavia. Aggression was committed by Serbia, by Serbs, supported by local Serbs in Croatia and in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Aggression started on Slovenia, moved on Croatia, continued in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bosnia and Herzegovina was defended by Republic of Croatia from the very beginning until the end, until the Operation Storm that I mentioned before and what was happening before. All saying that I am insisting that those are the facts. But I'm not insisting that any constitutional solution is the ideal or it should be on that. So I allow the conversation on my personal level. I allow conversation of any reforms on that. I do not allow talking about that. So if you or anyone will continue to talk like that, I'm simply leaving the stage, taking that as offensive to the country that I'm proud American, but also proud Croat, and I'm not political figure here, but I cannot allow that, because if we try to change the basic fact from the history, there is no way that we will end into anything constructive. Once again, I'm way more emotional than what I usually teach. I participate in that, and I don't remember last time when I could so difficultly pronounce what I want to say, because I do not remember when was the last time when I took something like that so emotionally, and I'm repeating to you. I hope that you just said that on easy way, as a joke, but if you think seriously about that, then we cannot communicate about anything. Thank you.
So I will let Dr. Mojanovic respond to that. So Dr. Mojanovic, the ambassador, has made it very clear that your position on this is historically inaccurate, sure, that the Bosnians and the Croats had joined forces, and he described it very clearly as we, you know, as this was a coalition of two groups of people. And he also made it very clear that, look, he agrees that reform is necessary, and the Croats are right behind that reform. And the Croats are actually the strongest supporters of Bosnia joining the European Union. This is a man who's obviously been the foreign minister of Croatia. He was involved in the Dayton negotiations. He's one of the key architects. So how would you respond to that?
Well, without sort of belaboring the point, I think there's really only 2 points of substance that need to be addressed here. One is we should, in fact, talk about the historical record, right? Like, we should be truthful about the historical record, and I think Foreign Minister Dino Konakovic had a very good line yesterday when he said, you know, don't ask politicians about history, ask historians. We're thankful and we're grateful to the entire community in The Hague and the entire legal sort of machinery behind the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which has established some of the basic facts, the legal facts of what took place on the territory of the former Yugoslavia, and specifically in the context of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And so I would just invite the audience to reflect on the rulings of that court, specifically with respect to the decision that has become known as the Herceg-Bosna 6 decision, which refers to a joint criminal enterprise in which the then leadership of the government of the Republic of Croatia was also implicated, including the president of Croatia. Now, it is certainly the case, it is certainly true, that by the end of the war, after the signing of the Washington Agreement, there was a joint operation between the Bosnian army and the Croatian army that was absolutely critical to the liberation of territories in Bosnia itself, as well as obviously Croatia in the face of Serbian aggression. And that is certainly someplace where we agree. I simply take the position that the Bosnian War does not occur in the period of April to October of 1992 and then somehow magically resumes after the signing of the Washington Agreement in 1994, which is to say that the period of most of the war in which the Croatian proxy forces in Bosnia-Herzegovina, again, a legal established fact by the ICTY, did actually take up arms against the legally recognized government of the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Those are historical and legal facts. And finally, I respect that the minister obviously has a different interpretation in terms of how different federal regimes work. He's absolutely right. The US has a unique federal system. Canada has a unique federal system. Germany has a unique federal system. We have interesting examples. You know, the UK, for instance, is a quasi-federal regime since having devolved certain powers to the so-called home countries. And we could go on and we could go on. The issue, again, however, is one of legal facts. It is not my opinion that the electoral regime of Bosnia-Herzegovina is discriminatory. That is the opinion of the court in Strasbourg. That is a legal fact. Now, anyone is entitled, within obviously sort of their legal rights, to go to the court in Strasbourg and appeal any of the decisions that have already been made by that court, whether it's Sejdić-Finci, whether it's Kovacevic, Pilav, Zornic, et cetera, et cetera. But those are the facts on the ground now. if anyone in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and I'm a huge advocate of people suing the state of Bosnia-Herzegovina, I would strongly encourage the citizens of Bosnia-Herzegovina to keep suing the state, because I do think it is an absolutely critical avenue. Ambassador Murphy is absolutely right that the decisions in and of themselves will not be sort of auto-implemented. But as we know from the history of the civil rights struggle in this country, right? Brown versus Board of Education, et cetera, Virginia versus Loving, et cetera, these landmark decisions are absolutely critical to moving a country towards full civic equality. They're not sufficient, but they are absolutely a basic requirement in a broader political process of reform.
Thanks. So I want to take a step back, Ambassador Murphy, and bring you in. Understand we've heard about the internal kind of dynamics and the disagreements and the different interpretations, but I want to come to you as the essentially the only outside party, not from within the region, and take a step back. The United States, has made it very clear that the priority is going to be Asia and China. They want to take a step back from Europe, what Kissinger called the shifting of the center of gravity from the Atlantic to the Pacific. How do we ensure that the United States stays engaged in this region? As we've heard from Ambassador Imunovich as well, is that, how can the US take on and Europe take on Putin when they've essentially been, the policy's been dysfunctional in the Balkans? So how do we ensure that the US stays engaged in this at a time when there's such shifting geopolitical sands?
That's a big question. I don't think the United States has been absent. I want to be fair here. I said earlier that I think the United States stepped back. We had a theory of change. We endorsed with the Europeans at the 2006, 2007, that time frame. I understand how those decisions were reached. And the United States was preoccupied at the time with events in Afghanistan and Iraq and the problems and threats associated with what was then called the global war on terror. And our resources are finite too in the United States, right? We don't have infinite resources. And as I said, that assumption that things were going to be managed effectively based on that theory of change was wrong. Doesn't mean we weren't there. We weren't active. We had ambassadors. We had embassy activism on a range of issues. We worked on corruption. We worked on democratization. We worked on economic reform. We did all those things. And I think you'll see the United States continue to do all those things, right? The question of the current geopolitical moment has been forcing the United States to rethink how it engages with the world, I would argue, for the last 15 to 16 years. This isn't a new challenge for the U.S. It goes all the way back, in some ways, to the first Obama administration. Right? I think it was then when we coined the phrase pivot to Asia. But what we find as Americans and as American diplomats, I'm a retired diplomat, so, I get to speak a little more frankly, is that we can't avoid being involved and engaged in Europe because our security interests are directly implicated in Europe. Right? And the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is an example of that. Right? Do we want and need the Europeans to play a more prominent role in addressing some of those challenges by spending more on defense, for example, reinvigorating the alliance? All those things are true. Now, with regards to Bosnia and Herzegovina specifically, we have had a bipartisan policy in Bosnia and Herzegovina for the last 30 years. I used to say it all the time in every interview I gave in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I'll say it again because it always bears repeating. We support the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and multi-ethnic character of the country. We need to see more effective, functional, and accountable governance, and we want to see the country integrated into Euro-Atlantic structures. That's both NATO and the EU. You go up on the Hill, if you're talking to Republican senators, or you're talking to Democratic senators, or Republican or Democratic members of Congress in the House, that's the policy. So the step one is maintaining the policy, right? That's the first step. And I think there is a compelling logic to that policy. If for no other reason, as I said earlier, our interest in the territorial integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's values-based, but it's also selfish, right? In the sense that, as I said earlier, if the country breaks apart, it will not likely be an amicable separation, right? Let me put it that way, right? And if it's not an amicable separation, it's likely to affect the region. I mean, we saw that in 92 to 95. We see it in the history of the region going back more than 100 years. And that's going to affect Europe, which is ultimately going to affect us. So our first principle has to be to maintain that policy that I mentioned earlier and to be sensitive to the threats that are posed to the territorial integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and then work with our partners to do something about them, right? Now, it is my view, and I think it's the view of most independent analysts, and our intelligence communities reached these views in its public reporting, public documents a year or so ago, that the rhetoric and actions of Mr. Dodik pose a threat to the territorial integrity of BIH, and there's a risk of violence if they are left unchecked. Since that report has been written and made public, things have gotten worse, not better, right? There have been more anti-Dayton, more unconstitutional acts, not less, right? I mean, you can't have a functional state if essentially one portion of that state is arguing, well, the state-level institutions don't have a right to work here. The state-level laws don't apply here, right? Well, that's what South Carolina said in 1861, right? It doesn't work. So the United States and the European Union need to deal with that problem. I do not believe that the attractive power of the EU is sufficient to solve it, right? And that is not a knock on the European Union. The European Union has done tremendous good in Europe, particularly after the end of the Cold War. And we talked about what happened to Croatia. It was transformed. I mean, I visited Croatia a lot. It's incredible, right? And the contrast between it and Bosnia is stark, right? But not just there. Poland, you know, the Czech Republic, all these places. Bosnia is unique. That's one reason Dayton looks the way it looks, right? And so you have to recognize that that incentive structure isn't what it is in Sarajevo or Mostar or Banja Luka the way it may have been in Warsaw or Zagreb. We also have to make use of all the tools we have at our disposal, right? I think it is a very good thing that European states are acting bilaterally to respond to the recent actions of Mr. Dodik, the sanctions in particular. Would I like to have to use sanctions? Of course not. We would prefer local actors to reach local agreements. I've been involved in trying to get local actors to reach local agreements, right, on constitutional reform, and that's the only way you're going to do it is through local. You can't impose it. Local actors are going to have to negotiate it. And invariably, these have failed because local actors haven't engaged in good faith negotiations. Sometimes they haven't engaged at all. They've folded their arms and pretended they were holier than thou and said, this is beneath me to talk. Call me when you have the perfect deal. Or they've tried to take shortcuts through legislation that you can't take. You have to use the Constitution. Now, what diplomats on the ground in the US and Europe can do is try to create incentives for them to engage in those kinds of negotiations. I think the reality of the current situation is that the prospect of meaningful constitutional reform in the near term is very, very slim. I mean, I keep saying this, we're talking about, when you see what's going on in Republika Srpska with Mr. Dodik and the legislation he's adopting and the acts he's taking, that's existential. We have to worry about getting to a 31st anniversary of the Dayton Peace Agreement. That's got to be our concern right now, okay? I also want to stress another point, since I have the microphone and I think it's important. Mr. Dodik likes to present this as an issue that is directed at Serbs. It is not. There are Serbs and Serbian political parties in BIH that want to work within the Dayton system, whatever its flaws. And that should be the focus of the Bosniak and the Croat political parties as well. I see Bosniak political parties focused on taking pot shots at one another. I'm sorry, this is particularly problematic with SDA. I understand the desire to want to win an election. Politics is politics, we all have it. But at some point, it needs to stop at the water's edge because of the nature of the threat you're posing. I see Mr. Chobot seeking to leverage a very serious threat into a minor, small political gain for him in the near term that won't hold up, most likely in a court of law, and he knows it, because he's been told it, and won't deal with the actual existential threat that is confronting the country right now, right? It would be a Pyrrhic victory, at best, just in that context alone. And, you know, I agree the international community needs to do better. I mean, the problem has never been the lack of conditionality on the part of the European Union. The problem has been the lack of willingness to enforce that conditionality, right? I mean, the purpose of EUFOR's mandate is not to keep it. It's to use it if you need to, because you have strategic interests and security interests you want to protect. But at the end of the day, the local actors are going to have to adjust. In that sense, the Deputy Secretary is right. They're going to have to make changes. But the responsibility on the local actors is different. Some actors have greater responsibility to change their behavior than others do. I mean, if you're trying to secede from Bosnia-Herzegovina, the responsibility on you is greater than it is anybody else's. You've merited that, right? And, you know, Dino Konakovic was right. They need courageous politicians. But one of the problems I've noticed, and I've said this to political leaders, is, you know, somebody's got to be the first person to do the right thing. You know, now is not the time, I think, if you're Bakir Izetbegovic, to be trying to score points at the Troika's expense. There'll be a campaign next year at which you can do it. You need to be working with them and with the RS opposition and others in the Croat community willing to work with you to form a government that's going to advance the country's European aspirations. There's two pieces of legislation. That's what's holding them back right now. That's a doable proposition, right? If you're for Mostar, that needs to be your focus as well, right? And if you want to make decisions that help improve the atmosphere in Herzegovina around Brownie Mosque or another set of issues, you can do those things. But the political leaders we often confuse for the peoples, you know, and that's a mistake, right? The peoples are your neighbors, people you live and work with every day. It's not necessarily the head of the largest ethno-nationalist political party of this group or that group. They are often working for their own narrow interests, as opposed to the interests of the people they claim to represent. And the result is the citizens of the country suffer. And many of them, as we heard yesterday, decide to leave. I mean, the last census, 2013, said, what, 3.3, 3.5 million people? There's probably not more than 2.7 million people in that country, right? So we can't sit back and, as the international community, including the United States, and pretend there isn't a problem, hope it's going to go away, or click our heels 3 times and say there's no place like the EU, there's no place like the EU, there's no place like the EU, and expect to get there. We have to be more proactive about it. One final point. All that requires mindset changes from all the international actors. One of the biggest ones is for the Union to accept and adjust to the fact that whether it's EUFOR or whether it's the OHR, those can be partners that can help facilitate and move the country forward. They can't substitute for local action, I agree with that, but they can play a role in containing and constraining the worst problems and actions of a group of people, some of the political leaders, who are not working towards these objectives, no matter how much they stand up and claim to be doing so. And as I said, the people can see it, and they don't like it, so they leave. And that's not, the people of the country deserve much, much better than what they're getting out of their leadership right now.
Thank you for that overview, Ambassador. So, final question before we move on to final thoughts to Ambassador Eminovic. You heard it straight there, Ambassador, that a meaningful constitutional reform, the possibility is very slim. There's too much internal division within Bosnia at the moment. You know, the existential threat is coming from the likes of Dodic, but this internal dissent, taking cheap political shots at each of the parties. In the previous panel, we heard about the problem of corruption and the brain drain of youth leaving the country simply because they don't feel fulfilled in their ambitions and their aspirations. Surely the question then is, you know, you have to get your own internal house in order before you look to external actors to manage that. So how would you respond to that?
what is important for us in Bosnia, which I would like to say, is that we would like to have a clarity from our European partners in particular. You know, we have some EU capitals right now that are actively supporting and sponsoring the tearing up of the Dayton Agreement and the B&H constitutional order. So this is obviously a major threat to Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also realistically to the security of Europe as a whole, as Ambassador mentioned. You know, you cannot just look at Bosnia and Herzegovina in isolation. Europe cannot afford to have another conflict in Bosnia because, you know, it never stays in Bosnia. And it certainly cannot afford to have another regional conflict in the Balkans. And it is likely that any security crisis in Bosnia and Herzegovina would definitely become a Balkan and a European crisis. What we need is the consistency and unity of message from our European partners, in particular when it comes to the Euro-Atlantic position in Bosnia. Because, you see, what's going on right now in Bosnia, due to the fact that there are some ruptures, in some divergences, I would say, within the Euro-Atlantic community regarding Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Western Balkans, there is a growing distrust and disillusionment amongst the Bosnian people. Many citizens and reform-minded actors express frustration over what they see as mixed signals from the Western capitals. For example, while some Western capitals emphasize the democratic reforms and the rule of law, others are perceived to tolerate or even reward obstructionist leaders in the name of short-term stability. Secondly, certain political leaders in Bosnia and Herzegovina, particularly those pushing secessionist and ethno-nationalist agendas, are exploiting these transatlantic divisions, these ruptures that exist, and to question the credibility and the commitment of Western institutions. And definitely this weakens the confidence in the EU and the NATO as reliable partners. One of the problems that nobody speaks about publicly so much in Bosnia is that some people, ordinary people, are trying to look beyond traditional Euro-Atlantic narratives, trying to find some other solutions. You will often hear from our European-oriented, I would say, politicians that Bosnian European integration process has no alternative. Unfortunately, there is. There is alternative which is bad, which is much worse. Some other integrations are also an alternative. We hope it will never happen, but the fact is that there are alternatives. And some people are, you know, resigning to stagnation or considering some alternatives, sometimes malign influences. And this is really a long-term risk for the stability of Bosnia. So what we would like to hear is the reaffirmation of commitment or clear and public recommitment of our European and American partners to territorial integrity, sovereignty, multi-ethnic character of Bosnia and Herzegovina and its Euro-Atlantic path. We need more symbolic gestures such as high-level visits. We need more EU and NATO initiatives that can help restore the faith in the international community as a whole. The key thing for Bosnia and Herzegovina is the most important thing, the key foreign policy objective is joining NATO. We believe that the US national interest in the region, in the Balkans, is to prevent a new conflict with Russia in Europe, and it can be only ensured if Bosnia and Herzegovina becomes a full-fledged member of NATO. Because the ability of the Russian proxies to block Bosnia's constitutional modernization, including NATO integration process, has become the most efficient platform for the permanent embedding of Russian geostrategic interests in the Balkans. And that's why Bosnia's NATO membership must be we believe must be a key strategic goal of the US in the region, and it would really change the geopolitical landscape of the region. We are very much aware that pro-Russian actors threaten to derail the country's future with the Western institutions by preventing our accession to NATO. And Ambassador Murphy was mentioning Milorad Dodik, the RS leader, who attempts to achieve de facto secession of the RS entity. And that is the most immediate, the most serious threat to the security and integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but as well to the stability and security of a broader region of the Western Balkans. And therefore, it's very important to highlight that these people, Milorad Dodik and his cronies and people around him, are definitely not partners for the US. They are instruments of Russian and to some extent Chinese geopolitical interests. Their policies are regional and geopolitical challenge that could cause a broader destabilization and open space for more Russian and Chinese influence. And that is why we believe that NATO needs to welcome Bosnia before it is too late. With pro-Russian actors on the rise in the region, the window of opportunity is closing. And how to do that? Of course, there are some examples. You know, in NATO's history, there are examples of the so-called strategic enlargement. And we believe that this model of NATO strategic enlargement can and should be applied to Bosnia. Just to mention a few, 1952, for instance, Greece became a member of NATO. It was immediately after the Greek Civil War. Or in 1955, West Germany, while still under US tutelage. Or Spain in 1982. It was just several years after Franco's dictatorship ended. So these are all examples where democratic development took a back seat to strategic imperatives. And we believe that this model should be applied in Bosnia as well. Because unless Bosnia is admitted quickly in the NATO, a Russian outpost in what should have been a NATO territory could become a new reality. And the ambassador said, you know, investing in the security of Bosnia is a direct investment in the European security. So I really hope that our friends in the capitals, in Western capitals, understand this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So we're running out of time, so we'll move on to final words. Ambassador Zozo, you've heard a lot here. If you can just give us your final thoughts in about 2 minutes.
No, I will not do it in 2 minutes because simply it's not fair.
Okay, go ahead. How much time do you need?
I don't know how much time I need. You didn't ask anybody else how much time they need.
We're just running out of time. I've been given the signal right there.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
But you should be thinking about that before.
Please proceed.
But I don't want to finish in disagreement with everyone, quite in contrary. I am very much in agreement what you said before. And I'm happy to hear that. I'm happy to hear, and not as somebody who can influence that, but as somebody who can observe it. I'm happy to hear that priority of Bosnia and Herzegovina is to become member of NATO. I do believe that that's good for entire region, and I'm particularly proud on my tenure as a Minister of Foreign Affairs that I was not only pushing Croatia, but in that time also Albania and Northern Macedonia to go, and later after that Montenegro. I do believe that that is necessity for the region. And I also agree that I do believe, again as observer, that the current organization or constitutional organization of Bosnia and Herzegovina is clearly not leading in that direction. And I do agree that it needs to be changed. But I think exactly same as it was at the beginning and now, the change can happen only providing two conditions. Number one is hopefully relatively easy. Yesterday's visit of the Deputy Secretary of State is proving that without American leadership, nothing will happen. Dayton wouldn't happen anything positive in Europe in entire 20th century. So it's the same here. American leadership is absolute necessity. That's the first prerequisite. The second, not just precondition, but actualities. It can be, the constitutional change can happen only based on the consensus of 3 constituent people. That's the reality. Because those 3 people, nobody invented. They exist on that territory for centuries. We cannot even speculate with the numbers because that number was changing throughout, many events that was affecting that very turbulent period of the globe and Bosnia and Herzegovina. But the fact is that there are true ethnical group, or as we say very correctly, true constituent people, Serbs, Bosniaks, and Croats living on that territory. How they will arrange that life and their common state, it is primarily up to them. I do believe and always believe that Croatia has can be of help with that, but also has a responsibility, also including the Dayton. Responsibility to see its first neighbor as a friendly country, as a co-partner in NATO, a co-partner in European Union. How we come to that, unfortunately? Unfortunately, that is what I want to talk more, but obviously I will not. I will respect the time. Don't worry about that. I want to share with you the thoughts how we came to that solution in Dayton. Unfortunately, Dayton, when you look day by day, as it is described in Holbrook's book, the only real document about Dayton, first part of the negotiation here, we spent on 2 issues, 2 very important. One is basically resolving the issue of Eastern Slavonia, and part of the efforts and delegations were divided on that. The other was how to resolve the issue of the federation. There was no real big issue. And it ended by supporting, by basically recognizing everything that was signed in Washington before, including the fact that federation is federation between 2 constituent people, not between territories. Not between territories. That was important part of the Washington Agreement and Dayton. And unfortunately, after that, somewhere in the middle of the way, we started to talk about the borders. I think that was a huge mistake. When you start to talk about borders, delineation, in fact, it almost looks like the vision of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Funny thing, ironical thing is, cynical thing is that Bosnian delegation even did not participate in that. They were sit aside and they didn't took the part in negotiation. All negotiation for them was done by Slobodan Milosevic, which, by the way, support my previous thesis. And finally, Dayton was signed, not by Bosnian representatives, but by Slobodan Milosevic in Dayton. In Paris, it was slightly different. So, unfortunately, we forgot. Somehow, we omitted, did not discuss the most important issue, if you ask me, and that is what is going to be constitutional structure of Bosnia and Herzegovina as a whole. And we ended in something which is correct to call asymmetrical structure, where you have one unitar part, which is Republika of Srpska, and one federal part, which is federation. Never in history existed something like that. There were unitar states, there are federal states, there are confederal states, but not such a kind of asymmetrical problem. And then we come to the problem that concerns me, and it should concern everyone. By the way, in Dayton, we also have constructive support of Russian Federation. Igor Ivanov, as Deputy Foreign Minister, was here, but that was different Russia. That was not Putin's Russia. What we have in this moment, we have Putin, who is directly having on remote control Dodik, and Dodik who is listening to Putin more than anybody else. And because of that, all of us should be concerned. And that is only one of the reasons, as I said, there are a number of the reasons why the peoples, 3 constituent people of Bosnia and Herzegovina, hopefully with the help of international community, primarily with the leading role of the United States, should address the issue how to correct the constitutional solution, not to allow something like that. And by the way, just to mention, and I'll finish with that, no court in the history of democracy can change the law. Every clever involvement in the changing of the law and constitution will take into account the position of the court, but just taking into account, not accepting that as implementation must. So the implementation must comes from the decision, consensus between three constituent people. I know that's not easy. It was not easy in Dayton. It is maybe now hopefully easier for at least two people, because I know for sure that Croats, and I absolutely believe that Bosniaks wants to see Bosnia and Herzegovina in NATO and European Union. To be very frank, I don't know is that position of the Serbs, but to address that, it is the only way how to come to the constructive solution. Sorry for taking
No problem
time.
at all. Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. We've run out of time, unfortunately. I'm getting the signal, but we end on the salient words of the Ambassador. Thank you so much for that. Lots of disagreement, heated discussion, which is actually very good. Lots of food for thought for everybody to take away. Lots of work to be done as well for all the parties that are involved, as we can see, to find common ground. So with that, we want to finish by thanking our esteemed panelists for coming here today and giving us their input and interpretation of what's happening.